All right, so, we love to dig into these alternative approaches, and the stuff you shared about the mandometer method, that really piqued my curiosity. I mean, we're talking about a whole different way of thinking about eating disorders, and frankly, anything that can help people break free from that struggle, that's got to be worth a closer look, right?
Absolutely. And you hit the nail on the head. It's a whole different way of thinking about it. The thing that I find so intriguing is this idea that it's not just about telling you what to eat, but it's actually about sort of rewiring, retraining your brain to recognize your body's own signals. Like imagine having that internal compass back, knowing when you're actually hungry versus is just emotionally hungry. That's huge.
It is huge. It's like you're learning to listen to your body again after maybe years of ignoring it. And it works alongside more traditional therapy, right? It's not like a replacement. It's more like, huh, it's a complement. Yeah. And that's actually a really important point because, traditional therapy, while of course well-intentioned, can sometimes leave patients feeling, I don't know, maybe a little judged or not fully understood. And that obviously makes it even harder to open up. And this is where the mandometer method really shines. It puts trust front and center, like building that strong foundation of trust with the patient. And of course, education and motivation, but that trust piece seems to be really paramount.
It makes sense. You have to feel safe before you can even start to heal, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things that jumped out at me was the focus on those initial patient interviews.
Yeah.
It's not about overwhelming them with information right from the get-go.
Absolutely not. It's about meeting them where they're at. And that's actually reflected in how the frequency of these conversations changes throughout the treatment.
Oh, how so? So you start with more frequent check-ins and then, exactly, you start with that really solid foundation. Lots of those conversations early on to build trust. And as the patient progresses, those conversations gradually become less frequent.
So there's this built-in shift toward independence that's really interesting, which I guess means meal times become less about therapy, less about analyzing everything and more about just actually enjoying food again.
It's about creating that safe space where the focus can shift away from those negative thoughts we all have around food and really tuning back into the positive aspects of nourishing your body.
Okay, so we're talking about building trust, reconnecting with your body, but what about the weight issue, right? I mean, that's a huge source of anxiety for a lot of people struggling with eating disorders. So how does the mandometer method even begin to approach that?
Yeah, you're right. You can't really talk about eating disorders without addressing the weight component. And this method gets that. It doesn't shy away from it, but it's not about obsessing over numbers. It's about helping the person reach a healthy weight as part of their overall recovery.
So how do they even begin to figure out what that target weight should be? Because I imagine that conversation could be, well, kind of fraught for someone who's, really struggling with body image issues.
Oh, absolutely. It's a delicate balance for sure. The material talks about two main strategies, and both of them seem designed to kind of minimize that anxiety. One of them actually involves a bit of, I guess you could call it reverse psychology.
Oh, okay. I'm intrigued. Tell me more about that.
So they'll ask the patient to think about someone they know who has a healthy body,
Mm.
and then they'll actually suggest a target weight that's slightly lower than that person's weight.
Wow, that's pretty clever actually. It's like it taps into that desire for a healthy body image, but it kind of takes the pressure off by setting a more, I don't know, achievable goal, I guess, than they might be expecting. What about the second strategy? When do they use that one?
They tend to reserve that one for situations where someone is really resistant to the idea of gaining weight at all.
Mhm.
Or if they're severely underweight. And in those cases, they'll start with a much smaller goal, like maybe a 2-kilogram increase, and they'll work towards that more gradually, over several weeks.
It's like taking baby steps, right? It feels a lot less overwhelming than focusing on this big long-term goal right away.
Exactly. Exactly. And here's another thing that really stood out to me. They actually emphasize the importance of not revealing the patient's actual weight throughout the entire treatment process.
Really, why is that?
It all goes back to shifting the focus away from that number on the scale.
Mhm.
By keeping it a secret, so to speak, they're actually empowering the patient to let go of that need for constant control and start trusting their body's internal cues again.
It's like taking the power back from the eating disorder. And speaking of empowerment, I was really struck by how much emphasis this method puts on rebuilding self-confidence, especially for younger patients. I mean, eating disorders can be so damaging to a person's self-esteem. So how do they even begin to tackle that?
They actually use concrete evidence,
Hmm.
which I think is really, really cool. It's one thing to, tell someone you can eat normally, but it's another thing entirely to actually show them. And that's where the mandometer device itself comes in.
Okay, yeah, walk me through that. How does the device provide that kind of tangible proof?
So the patient will actually use the device during their meals, and it tracks things like their eating speed, portion size, all of that in real time. And it gives them this instant feedback so they can literally see what a normal meal looks like for their body.
So they can see that they're capable of eating a normal-sized meal at a healthy pace without, all of those feared consequences. That's got to be incredibly empowering to see that with your own eyes. It sounds like the therapist plays a very active role in this whole process.
They really do. And it's important to emphasize that it's not about control, but it's about providing that structure and support, especially in the beginning. The therapist is there to guide the patient toward rediscovering their own, inner wisdom when it comes to food in their body.
It's like learning to ride a bike with training wheels. You need that initial support to gain the confidence, but eventually you're able to ride on your own. Speaking of the journey, I was really interested in how this method breaks down the stages of change.
Ah, yes, the 5 stages of change, from pre-contemplation all the way to maintenance. And understanding those stages is so crucial because it shows us that the change isn't linear. People might bounce back and forth between those stages, and that's completely normal.
It's not a straight line to recovery. It's more like, one of those winding roads.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for the therapist to really meet the patient where they're at in that journey and tailor their approach accordingly.
Speaking of maybe needing a little extra guidance, there was this term in the material that really jumped out at me, the guest in treatment. What does that even mean? A guest. That's an interesting way to put it. So are we talking about someone who's just, I don't know, along for the ride, but not really invested in doing the work?
It's kind of like that, yeah. They might look like they're, going through the motions, following the meal plan, showing up for therapy, but their heart isn't really in it.
Wow, that's going to be tough for everyone involved, especially the patient. So how does the mandometer method actually address that? I mean, do they just kind of call them out on it?
It's not so much about being confrontational as it is about, well, about holding up a mirror, I guess. It's about saying, hey, I see where you're at, and I also know you're capable of so much more than this. And that might look like working with them to set really specific, measurable goals. Maybe outlining the consequences if those goals aren't met. Sometimes even involving loved ones can be helpful in those situations.
So it's about building that support system and really encouraging them to take ownership.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And this kind of ties into another really important aspect of the mandometer method, which is this idea of breaking down those, big, scary changes into smaller, more manageable steps.
Like, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time?
Exactly. It's about those small victories, those little wins that add up over time. And that's really where positive reinforcement comes in. The therapist will work with the patient to help them recognize and actually celebrate those wins, no matter how small they seem.
It makes you realize if you're always focused on the finish line, it's easy to get discouraged. But if you're celebrating those milestones along the way, I imagine that really helps to stay motivated. Of course, we can't talk about recovery without talking about setbacks. They're going to happen. So how does this method help people deal with those bumps in the road?
That's where, learning to navigate different environments and handle triggers comes in. Think about it. Someone might be, doing really well in the controlled environment of a clinic, but then they go out to a restaurant or to a party where, food is everywhere, and those old thought patterns can start to creep back in.
It's like taking the training wheels off, right? It can feel kind of scary at first.
Exactly. And so the mandometer method really emphasizes this gradual expansion of that comfort zone. It's about giving people the tools and the confidence to face those challenging situations. And when it comes to, staying motivated, this method also places a lot of emphasis on rewards and positive reinforcement.
I'm betting these rewards aren't just about, getting a gold star sticker, right?
You're right. It's about incorporating things into their routine that they genuinely enjoy. Maybe it's giving them, more freedom, more autonomy as they progress, or maybe it's, planning an activity they'd really love to celebrate a milestone. It's about creating this positive feedback loop that reinforces those healthy habits and makes recovery more sustainable in the long run.
It's amazing, when you really dig into it, just how multifaceted this approach is. I mean, it's not just about changing what you eat, it's about changing your whole relationship with food and with your body.
Right. And that's really what it's all about, isn't
Yeah.
it? It really highlights the fact that recovery is not so much a destination as it is a journey. And it's about equipping people with the skills and the self-awareness they need to navigate that journey as their healthiest, most authentic selves.
Such a powerful message. And I feel like we've only just scratched the surface of the Mandometer method today, but it's clear that it's doing something really, really different and from what we're learning, something really effective.
It really seems to be.
And even if we're not, personally struggling with a full-blown eating disorder, I think there's something in this approach that we can all connect with. I mean, think about your own relationship with food for a minute. How often are you actually eating because you're hungry versus because you're stressed or bored or just because it's, time to eat? It's given me a lot to think about.
Food for thought, for sure.